Hey, in sync.
Hello. How are?
Good. Yeah, how about yourself?
Yeah, doing well.
Great. Yeah, today we're going to talk about your model, the M theory. Um, yeah, I'd love to start with maybe you could just describe the model in your own words.
Yeah. So I guess I would usually think of it as a kind of a naturalistic metaphysics, like a lot of uh prominent metaphysics in the culture are religious in nature. They basically posit the existence of some transcendental entity as the ground of being, or the ground of the existence of our world at least. And DM theory basically sort of tries to ask, well, you know, is there an explanation that just relies on the kind of principles that are like actually observable in the environment, and sort of can we derive a scheme that sort of gives us an idea of how come there's something rather than nothing from principles like that?
Cool. I haven't heard you use that frame of like a naturalistic metaphysics, but
Mhm.
I like that distinction. So DM theory is data logic meta theory, right?
A datalogical metaphysical theory.
Or data logical metaphysical theory, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Although I kind of like what the
the meta
datalogical
theory,
meta theory. Yeah,
like
because
can
it
have
is
the
in a way a meta theory.
Yeah, yeah, that's why, and maybe that's why I'm getting mixed up because I've been seeing it as that. um, and it's got quite a history. Like you've told this story to me before, but maybe you could tell it again, kind of for the origins of the
Yeah,
thinking.
yeah. Well, that really connects up actually with the thing where I introduced it, as a naturalistic metaphysics, because um, it sort of came out of an existential crisis I had, for quite an extended existential crisis, really, where I was suicidal and trying to figure out why I was here, say, and I have been an atheist for the vast majority of my life, so you know basically the thought was, well, if there were a mind at the bottom of everything to sort of create the world, then that I think attenuates the mystery a lot. Like, obviously, the question still remains, what is the exact nature of that entity? But in the absence of a supposition like that, it would seem extremely clear that there should be anything at all. Like, surely something is more complicated, nothing is simpler. Why wouldn't the simpler thing just be the case? I guess is the intuition that I initially had. And yeah, so I proceeded along the lines of trying to understand that really a timeless conundrum of why is there something rather than nothing, and I guess part of how I eventually came up with DM theory was by asking, I guess, what's presupposed in the cogito. I guess, like, with the cogito, I think that's quite a firm foundation to start from. I doubt, therefore I think I am. I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. Thus I exist. I mean, it's obviously here I am. After all, that's the frame of reference that I have to start from. And then, so I guess what I was trying to do was to sort of figure out what is assumed in that. And that sort of description of how I got there is actually it's very truncated or summative. Because really what I was doing wasn't, that I guess what I'm describing now is with the processes that were operating in the background, the philosophical journey but obviously at the time I wasn't really concerned with big questions like that at all. I was much more concerned with, why shouldn't I kill myself? And more particularly, actually, I was concerned with how to explain to all my very intelligent friends why it made sense that I wanted to kill myself, and how, in fact, that was, to my mind at the time, the most logical solution. because my thought was basically like, in a world where there is no ultimate reason for things to be here, what really is the point of, life is suffering. You have to struggle to survive. And, and in the absence of some overarching purpose, which seemed impossible to my mind at the time, why continue struggling? It just doesn't seem like it's a fruitful way to exist. And so what I ended up doing was what I wanted to do was to come up with a comprehensive analysis of existence so that I could fortify my claim that there's nothing logically problematic about me killing myself, I guess. And in order to do that, what I basically did was I asked all the different questions I could think of about the nature of existence. So who, what, when, where, why, and how. And I asked them along two parallel lines, with respect to, I guess, the objective nature of things, who, what, when, where, why, and how, and with respect to the subjective nature of things. And it was really in the question of why and how, those two questions, that I really started to get into territory I wasn't expecting. Yeah. And those questions, I think, revolve around the nature of nothingness and what, and that's that a question I mentioned at the beginning of why is there something rather than nothing. And, in the analysis of subjective existence, that's what brought me to the cogito, because that's, I think, the firmest and the most reliable statement of the problem in those terms. And I kind of just thought, well, I generally think of the process of philosophy as the unearthing of assumptions that are kind of implicit in the reasoning that we do, and then the questioning of those assumptions. And so, what I tried to do was try to generalize to reveal the assumption. So when you sort of say, well, I think, I am, I exist, what these things are, to my mind, they're like the assertion that there's some content of some kind, right? The specific nature of the content is obviously related to subjectivity and the nature of subjectivity. But in order to make an assertion like that, you basically have to sort of make the presupposition that that information exists in some form. That's what you're sort of, an observation is like a kind of representation of information, right? And that's what I think, I doubt, I think, I am, that kind of thing. Those are all representations of information, and obviously, thus, therefore, ergo, which is what it is in Latin. These are all invocations of logic, right? It's a way of inferring something from what came before. And so I basically thought, well, the basic presuppositions of the cogito are that there's data or information, and that there's logic. And I thought that's quite an interesting distillation. And I kind of thought, well, and this part was just a whim, really. I kind of thought, well, what if, like, I wonder if those aspects, those sort of irreducible elements that I couldn't think of a way of getting beyond, underneath those. Any kind of underneath would seem to just be another reiteration of that same sort of structure. And I kind of thought, well, is that just subjective? Is that just the sort of irreducible presuppositions of subjectivity? Or might that instead be something sort of foundational to existence itself? And so it was exploring that question of, well, imagine that those two things are like foundational to existence itself, where I started to realize it actually seems like, you can't get beyond these even on an objective level. Like there's nothing that's not composed of these sort of elements. And that sort of led me to identifying, I guess, the transcendental ground of being, that's something that necessarily is the case with data and logic. And the kind of scheme that followed from that, I was very surprised to find made a lot of sense. So I was like, when I make that assumption, it actually kind of looks like the whole world fits very neatly into that paradigm. And not only that, but kind of like the existence of our particular world seems to make a lot of sense in that frame of mind. Um, and I was very surprised by that. And ever since I've been, quite astonished that a solution that to my mind seems so simple could at the same time seem so unerringly correct. Yeah.
Cool. And how did that impact you? Because you said that you were going through a kind of existential crisis and on the verge of, or trying to rationalize committing suicide. So yeah, what did these discoveries shift in you?
Well, it gave me something to work with, somewhere to stand. I was able to, I guess, anchor my questions about myself and the meaning of my own life on something that I felt like, and I was shocked because I wasn't expecting to find anything really, and to be able to come at the end of that and to kind of say, oh, actually, it's not completely, nonsense like that you can't make sense of, like there's no purpose or rhyme or reason to existence, and actually to start sort of fitting together the pieces of that puzzle of what's my nature in light of that, and I guess what's the meaning of my life and the meaning of life in general. And answers to those kind of questions started to come a lot easier once I had something to base them on.
Cool. Well, I'd love to get more into the weeds and the details of data and logic. But first, I'd love to just ask a quick question of what would you say that DM theory is not?
Not. It's not a grand unified theory of physics. I think that a lot of the time, theories of everything, there's a kind of a conflation that happens in that territory where we're talking about, a grand unified theory of any kind, which is like, I think of metaphysics as being beyond physics, sort of. It's first, the definition of metaphysics is the science of first principles, and I think of first principles as basically the kinds of things that have to be true in order to fit for physics to even be possible, right? Let alone actually real. So as providing, I guess, the conditions of possibility for the world as we know it. And a lot of the time, a theory of everything is taken to be synonymous with a grand unified theory of physics, which the ambitions of which are to unify the physical forces in a sort of a simple singular equation. I think that metaphysics and DM theory can provide helpful hints in that direction, but it's never been in the ambition of my theory to offer a definitive formulation of the details of such a solution. Um, I just don't necessarily think that that's in the domain of metaphysics. That seems to me to be derivative of and secondary to metaphysics.
Right. So would you say that a theory of everything would use metaphysics to help ground its attempt at unifying physics, for example?
Yeah, yeah, I would think so. Yeah,
Yeah. But I get the sense that, and at least I think this personally, is that your metaphysical theory, DM theory, is a really great ground for that project. And it's definitely something that I think I'm interested in and you're interested in, and that together we're kind of
yeah, yeah,
opening up those doorways and exploring.
yeah, definitely. I think physics is one of the sort of, it's on that cutting edge of our understanding of the universe, and it has a lot of very interesting contradictions, between our various ways of modeling physics that, call out for a resolution. And, that resolution is, to my mind, is obviously going to be a unifying, something that sort of brings them all together and synthesizes it into some kind of simple formula. And yeah, I definitely see DM theory as providing a very informative ground for that, and I think there's some physical theories on the market, so to speak, already, that implicitly presuppose something like DM theory in terms of treating the universe as information, and I think there's a lot of merit to that kind of approach, and that the synthesis of the future will take some form like that. And I'm also partial to a many interacting worlds kind of theory of quantum physics, and not that, of course, that resolves the difficulties between our frameworks of quantum mechanics and, for instance, the theories of relativity. But, it sort of helps to give us a direction in terms of how to pursue and progress the research. But I think in terms of providing a foundation, generally the way I think about it is like, DM theory is like the kind of, when you're solving a puzzle, there's the edge pieces, and you get all the edge pieces together. And then that makes it a lot easier to sort of work your way inward and assemble the rest of the puzzle. And, the exact details of where all those pieces go, it's not precisely predicted by the nature of the edge pieces, but they serve as a kind of a very reliable guide for choosing where to place each of the other pieces. And as you go along, it all starts to take on a sort of a feeling of cohesion and unity and coherence that, that bespeaks of its ultimate truth, I guess.
With that puzzle analogy, one thing that the edge does do is that there are specific pieces that fit in next around the edge. Do you feel that that still fits with the analogy with DM theory?
Yeah, definitely. Yep.
Yeah. So I'm curious to get into that a little bit more later, but just a quick question was, because with DM theory, DMT, was that intentional relating to DM?
It's a happy accident.
um, I was curious about, with DM theory, do you feel like there are particular areas that you think need more clarifying, or that you kind of are open to movement within the framework, or is it kind of solid, like, oh, this is it, I've got it down?
Yeah. I mean, so there's 3 steps to the main thrust of the theory. The first step, I usually describe it as the, irrefutable, indubitable. This step, I think, is just unquestionable, which is that there has to be something, because nothingness is just not possible, basically. And yeah, so I usually think of that. I sometimes use an analogy of a light switch, where on is like the existence of things and off would be the non-existence of things. And, just by its definition, the off just isn't there. You know what I mean? So it can only be on. But in more technical terms, what that is it's when you have a true dichotomy, and one of the options of the true dichotomy is logically impossible, the other one must always be true. And questions like, well, what caused it to exist, or what caused it to be the case, just stop making sense, because there's just not, you don't have to cause something for which there's no options or no alternatives. Causing, the notion of causality always has in mind the idea that something could be or could fail to be. And if something cannot fail to be the case, then it doesn't need to be caused, because it's never not the case. So that's the first step. The second step is the identification of the nature of that something that always is with data and logic, which, I'd put the probability that that's correct probably around 90%. That seems to me a really graceful simplification of the details of the nature of existence. But it's the third step that I think is really open to revision, and I'm open to alternative ways of formulating this. And the third step is what I usually call the derivation of specificity. It's basically, once you have the assertion of a transcendental ground that's necessarily the case, and you have an identification of the nature of that transcendental ground, the question naturally arises, okay, well, we have these sort of very high and mighty ideas about like the exact nature of existence, but I mean, how do we get from there to here is really the idea. How come this particular world with all its sort of specific and complex structure. How do we get to here, and why does this world in particular exist rather than any other world that conceivably could be the case instead? And the solution I present in DM theory is basically that there's that absolute data that necessarily exists, and then relative to that, sort of embedded within it as a kind of a context, a logical context, is theoretical data, right? Which I would think of as basically all the possible ways that data could exist, but doesn't on the most absolute level. And then in that possibility space of theoretical data, you have, endless possible permutations of variables, and within which this is obviously this world's a logical possibility. Here it is, after all. And so you kind of get this world for free just because it's possible. It's naturally going to be contained in that possibility space. That step, I think, is much more open to question. How satisfying that is, I ultimately leave up to the reader. It's not something I can say. And certainly, I think that there are other ways of closing that loop and getting us from there to here. And I'm open to hearing what other proposals other people have about how to perform that derivation of specificity, because I'm by no means convinced that my way is the only way of making sense of that part of it.
Cool. I wanted to touch on something you just mentioned. You said that you were 90% sure about the part 2, and I was curious if you could speak to that 10% of doubt that you have. Like, is that clear in your mind? Like, what that could mean?
What that means is just that I think that data and logic is a very, as I said, a very graceful simplification. But it could be that there's another way of specifying the nature of that absolute. Some people, for instance, go in for consciousness or mind, as the ground, as the nature of that ground. And in fact, this is the notion of religion, the notion at the heart of religion. Every religious person agrees that there has to be something non-contingent. They just call that thing God, and I've never seen an argument for identifying it with God that I've found compelling. That certainly doesn't mean no one could ever come up with one. And even if it were not God or mind or consciousness, or however you might phrase that, in principle, there could be another formulation other than data and logic. Now, I'm inclined to think that that would be synonymous or interchangeable on that level, but it might not be. And really, it's hard to tell without actually coming face to face with an alternative formulation of that step to be able to tell which is superior and whether they're conceptually equivalent or what have you.
So, yeah, I imagine that any conception of God based on DM theory would be just as synonymous with data as opposed to adding anything to the concept of data that doesn't exist there.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to describe a concept of God in line with data and logic, it would be, I see metaphysics as being about the ground, the ground of being. And I guess I would think of God as the pinnacle or the highest point, like maybe similar to, Terence McKenna's transcendental object at the end of time, like an emergent end state where consciousness sort of evolves and complexifies and fuses into some kind of hive mind cosmic consciousness kind of, yeah. And that even potentially then goes on to spawn new worlds, to have inner worlds and inner worlds. I'm not sure, but I would usually think of it, I guess, as the kind of most complex manifestation of data and logic rather than as something fundamental or at the bottom.
Cool. Just letting that sink in. yeah, for some reason there's a concept album from a band that I like about a character who goes into a machine to experience the being at the beginning of time, who creates everything, and then at the end of the album, spoiler alert, he realizes that he has become that being in another reality somewhere, and kind of giving birth to a new existence.
Yeah. What's the album called?
It's by Arion, the Universal Migrator. That's what it's called.
Oh, cool. Good name.
Um. Anyway, yeah, I'm curious to get more into some details around data and logic, because data you described as the absolute, and then logic is like what I would interpret as like the process, or the way that absolute kind of does stuff in some way.
Sort of, yeah. I usually think of as a way of, I guess, illuminating what I mean by data and logic. I would think of a number of synonym pairs. So data and logic I think of as synonymous to substance and structure, or essence and form. And obviously I have more precise definitions that I provide in the theory, in the paper. So data I identify with non-contingent, uninterpreted information. And logic to me is consistent relational structure. So it's sort of the regularity inherent, like form or structure, but specifically a notion of consistent structure, consistent connections between individual parts of that whole, I guess.
Mm. I know that a lot of people who like to use the idea that information is fundamental, they're still physicalists in a strict sense of a term.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, how does your model depart from that definition, if it does, of physicalism?
Yeah. I mean, I think that in that case, like, information is just being taken as a brute fact in that physical sense, which I regard as unacceptable. The only things I think can be brute facts are things for which there are no alternatives, like, so for which an explanation is not necessary because they're self-explanatory in that way, right? Whereas physics and the nature of physical information doesn't seem self-explanatory. It seems open to questions. And I guess generally how I think of any kind of physicalist project is that it just commits itself to an explanatory lacuna at the bottom. Because, when we try to explain the particular values that physical variables have, we might appeal to sort of other physical forces or mechanics, fields, however we might construe that. And I guess sort of explain the values that the ones that we can observe have by appealing to more fundamental physical variables. But of course, those then stand in need of an explanation. If you continue trying to furnish a physical explanation, you kind of run into a wall where, you either have to say, well, this is a brute fact, or you have a regression of some kind. And the kind of explanation that's needed is one that sort of transcends physicality, something that's based in necessity, not in contingency. And physics, I would always identify with contingency, things that could be otherwise, could be other than they are, could have values different to what they do. And I think that, idea of an infinite regression of contingency is logically problematic, and it becomes, that problematic nature becomes significantly more noticeable once you sort of are using it in an ontological context or a metaphysical context. Because, the idea of, an infinite chain where each link in the chain, each prior link in the chain sort of justifies the existence of the next link. No, at no point does that does any link in the chain justify that there should be a chain. Why is there a chain at all? That's not, there's no way in that framework to explain the existence of the chain, which is ultimately the question. Why is there something at all? So you can't really, it doesn't seem right to me to appeal to sort of an infinitely regressing a chain of contingencies as a way of explaining the fact of contingency, because we're just never given an explanation. And there's a number of analogies that I think really illustrate this point well. My favorite one is probably the sniper analogy. Imagine you have a sniper, he's got eyes on the target, he's ready to go, ready to fire. But before he can fire, he has to radio into his immediate superior and get confirmation that, it's all good, go ahead, take the shot. Now, the thing is, his immediate superior also has to radio into his immediate superior, and so on, right? And then the question is, well, does the bullet ever get fired? And the usual thought is that unless there's an end as the request goes up the chain, then the confirmation can never begin to come down the chain. And that confirmation coming down the chain is like conferring existence onto things, so when we talk about an infinite regression, the idea is that existence is passed along the chain, but unless there's something that makes the chain, like either the chain exists or there's some stopping point such that, something sort of non-contingent, something that's self-existent, then there's no existence to pass on, basically.
Yep. I know that some people advocate for a physicalism, even with information as the ground. Sometimes that is because there's a fear that bringing in metaphysics or non-physical means letting in the door for any kind of nonsense that you want. So I'm curious how you tackle that with DM theory. Yeah, how does the theory or tackle that issue of woo, as they call it, it's getting in through the door?
I guess, how does it? I mean, I think it would be like, that's one of the reasons I call it a naturalistic metaphysics, is it's got to be derivable from the things that we actually observe. Like, I think part of the fear about metaphysics is that because it's unobservable, you can kind of just say whatever you like, and there's no way to prove it or disprove it, and that in some way sort of provides a license for those people who say whatever they who sort of propose whatever they like to kind of say, well, no, my theory is the right one. And I guess, like, the way I would get around that is just to impose kind of the norms of scientific sense making onto the paradigm. Obviously, there's no empirical verification or falsification, or it's hard even to see how you can experimentally pursue the hypothesis. But regardless, what we can do is we can sort of engage in peer review and sort of just ask, and more generally of the consensus, does this make sense? So is it like logically consistent? Does it satisfy the explanatory demands? Does it help us to understand how come this world is here? And is it simple? Is it parsimonious? Does it assume as little as possible and as much as necessary in order to achieve the ambitions of an explanatory project like that? And I think that if you sort of stick to those general guidelines, that you have a basis for evaluating competitor metaphysical theories that sort of gives us a way of boxing out the ones that make the kind of assumptions that would traditionally be associated with woo.
I guess if you're creating a naturalist metaphysics, as you put it, from what exists and like knowledge and using the scientific method, does that also reflect back the other way? Like if you've captured something at the foundation that's necessary and specific, does that then reflect all the way back up the chain, back to, say, experience? And like, is there something common about the foundations that appears all the way up?
Well, yeah, I think that's what would give us epistemic access to those kind of elements. I guess I make the assumption that whatever the nature of the ground is, it's holographically distributed throughout the whole thing. It's like written into the very concept of a law of nature. I would think of it as there's a German word, I don't know what it is though, for an assumption that's so baked in to your perceptions that you never even think to name it, you know. And I would think of it something like that, like it's something so obvious, so ubiquitous, you know, that it's part of absolutely everything you could observe. But it's precisely that makes it somewhat difficult to put your finger on, because, you know, there's no way to single it out. And this is actually what makes it so difficult to empirically verify, is, you know, on the one hand, all we have is physicality. You know, there's no way to sort of reach through to the foundation of existence and test that. But also there's no way to isolate the relevant variables, because any possible situation that you could devise is going to also conform to the sort of first principles. There's no way of, you can't devise a situation where the first principles wouldn't be operative, because there just isn't such a situation.
So we can't get there empirically, but have you yourself got any examples of how the foundations sort of are reflected in that fractal or holographic way? Like, have you got a simple way of thinking about it, like in terms of, say, atoms or human behavior? Or
That's partly what I was trying to say, is that, you know, there's no example you can think of anything that isn't reducible to data and logic. You know, atoms, human behavior, human experience, you know, whatever it is, any particular you can think of, you can always look at it and go, okay, you know, here's the information that this consists in, and here's the structure that information has. That seems to be an inherent structure in the nature of things. And like, there's no particular thing you look at that sort of tells you that, but rather it's the fact that you can kind of like exhaustively enumerate all of the things of which you're aware, and you never find an exception, something that doesn't conform to those principles.
okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, well, I'd love to get more into the specifics of data and logic even more. Like, why did you land on data, for example, as your
Yeah.
absolute ground?
So data, in the sense of it being uninterpreted information, right? So I think the reason for landing on non-contingency kind of makes sense, in that that's what the ground has to be. The ground has to be something necessary, something foundational, something that transcends physicality, that transcends contingency, you know. So, and the idea of identifying it with, because data obviously specifically names information as a type of information, or maybe a precursor to information. And so my thought is, I guess, that, uh, well, everything that you can think of is made of information, and that's what I originally derived from the cogito, was, you know, these different forms of information. And then I make the assumption, or comes in the thought that the world is there before you're there to look at it. You know, our scientific picture of the cosmos tells us pretty clearly that planets were forming before there was ever life forms, you know. And we have like quite a sophisticated picture of the history of the cosmos that sort of places life in an extremely limited window. You know, that things exist way before that. And in general, I think that this principle is a reliable guide to thinking about the world, you know. So one analogy I often like is that of fossils, you know. When you dig up a fossil, you know, do you make it be there, but by, you know, by digging it up, or was it there before you came along to dig it up? That's how you were able to discover it, right? To uncover, to sort of find it. The usual intuition is that it's already there. That's kind of how it's possible to find it in the ground there. And you know, another example I like is, you know, you can imagine some corner of the world no humans ever been to. Let's say no life. You know, it's a wasteland. the conditions don't permit any kind of life, and there's this frozen lake there or something. And there's that lake, the water has properties, right? And those properties are constitutive of the nature of that environment and don't rely on consciousness in order to have the properties that they do, in order to be the way that they are, rather. And so I guess my thought is that, information, that's really what we name it when we've perceptually assimilated it and used it to tell us about what the world is like. It informs us about the nature of things. And prior to that, it just sits there dormant in a way. And I call that dormant information data. The information prior to being assimilated by a perceptual agent, I call that data. And so the thought is basically that, that stuff that the world is made of when people aren't looking at it, is, at the bottom of things, that's non-contingent. And that's the most general form of like thingness that we really know how to talk about is this information. But then the reason I transfer from information to data is that subtracts the notion of being perceptually assimilated, which doesn't seem necessary for the data to exist.
Is there anything else that the label data gives to that ground other than that pre-information element? Does it presuppose like any specific rules or structure or properties or anything like that?
No. Apart from, of course, the connection with logic. For me, data and logic are sort of inextricable. They're intertwined in an inextricable way. And so that you can't have data without logic, and you can't have logic without data. The same way as you can't have substance without structure. And there's no such thing as a structureless substance. Like, that's just not a thing. And similarly, you can't have a substanceless structure. You can't have structure that doesn't inhere in something. Again, it's just not a sensible idea. So apart from the non-contingency and the uninterpreted information, there's the notion of its necessary connection, and that inextricable, and that's part of the idea is that that even that talk is enthralled to that idea of the ubiquity of logic, because the very idea of connection is essentially what I identify logic with. So consistent relational structure, relations, relativity. That's, I think, the essence of logic, is the notion of connections between things, and the necessity of a context, of a foreground and a background, the necessity of there being consistency and regularity, and a form to the way that things are. Things don't just exist in kind of an amorphous blob. There's a definitive nature to the way that things are. And that's how I would identify logic.
Would logic then be akin to having kind of dimensionality in some sense, or like time and space, for example?
Yeah, I think dimensionality and especially time and space are like specific types of logic. They're specific structural paradigms, I suppose. I think, the most basic types of logic would be sort of the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, the principle of sufficient reason. These, to me, I think, are the most fundamental constraints. And that for me looms large, I guess, in the derivation of specificity part of the model. Because it's by relying on, I see those laws as being a sort of constitutive of the nature of reality, sort of written in at the most fundamental level, I guess, as principles that sort of dictate what forms reality can take. And so, that's the thing, is dimensionality, and especially space and time. I see those as sort of derivative and entailments of the more fundamental forms of structure, namely the sort of the principles of logic. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because it's by studying the sort of dimensionalities such as space and time that we end up deriving our own subjective conceptions of logic. It's by sort of abstracting the regularities that can be observed in, these more complex domains, that we get a glimpse of the sort of fundamental principles that guide our inferences towards truth. And the only reason it makes sense for those principles to guide our inferences towards truth is if those things are fundamental to the object of existence itself. Because if they weren't, then they wouldn't work for us, And the fact that, I guess that structure is written into the environment, it makes a lot of sense that, through the process of evolution, our minds would mold themselves to those regularities in the natural world, because obviously that's how you survive, is by sort of learning to model what's going on and model it effectively. And the way to model it effectively is to extract out, through the process of abstraction, the kind of principles that are operative at the most fundamental level.
There's a sense that before maybe like our universe exists in data logic, that there's this kind of timelessness, and it's almost like infinite and eternal, which kind of doesn't make sense pre-space-time, but that's the sense of it. Is, would you put those words on data logic as this something that always necessarily exists?
Eternal, yes, but I don't see, the thing is that it's not really before space-time, because space-time as an embedded extension of that transcendental ground also always exists. So there's no before after space-time. Space-time is like an eternal logical object. It's not the most absolute level of the eternal. That's what I would identify with data logic. But it's not like, the absolute exists and then sort of later on, you get space-time. It's like you have the absolute, and like as a sort of a necessary extension of the absolute, you always have these logically possible worlds, one of which being sort of the locally observable space-time.
Okay, so something like what we perceive as time, as like you say, from the Big Bang till now, does all of that exist at the same time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm generally a subscriber to the B theory of time. So the B theory of time sort of says past, present, and future. These are perspectival distinctions. They depend on like where you're situated. And I usually think of it as, I guess, like the universe as a timeline, a spatio-temporal sort of object, the entirety of which exists at once. And then, how we usually think of time is a perspectival function of what it's like to exist within that object as just a part. But if you were to sort of, I guess, stand apart from it and look at it, I often analogize it to video files on a computer hard drive. Once you sort of press play, sort of things are changing and the characters are moving around in a linear sort of fashion, But pressing play that's not the beginning of the existence of the file, And, from a distance, like that whole timeline exists on your hard drive prior to you opening up the file and looking through it and taking a perspective. And sort of, that, I guess, everything that will happen or has happened or can happen in that file is already encoded in it as a complete logical object.
Is that a kind of fatalism then, like that our future is already exists in a file somewhere, and that everything that plays out will just play out exactly how the file suggests?
It's definitely a type of determinism, but I usually distinguish between determinism and fatalism. A fatalism is the idea that there's nothing you can do to change what will happen. And determinism has overtones of that, but the thing is that we're active participants in the sort of in what was always going to happen. You know what I mean? And so our actions play a meaningful role in influencing what the future will look like. And so fatalism has the idea that there's no point trying, basically. That's the connotation of a fatalistic outlook, is there's no point trying to change things because whatever's going to happen was always going to happen. But the thing is that it's in your nature to try to change the future to be better than it is, and opting out of that on the basis that, well, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. I see that as just an abdication of responsibility. And it's a kind of a cop-out. It's like a way of not trying, it's not putting in the effort and struggling to make things better, and then blaming that on the universe, when in reality, it's like, yeah, what the universe is going to look like in its final state is in a sense predetermined. But it's predetermined that you were supposed to play an active role in the realization of those possibilities. And, to kind of give yourself a way out of doing that hard work, because, well, ultimately it's always going to be whatever it's going to be. I just think of that as lazy thinking and lazy morally as well.
Right. So it's not, even though the whole of the file exists already, so the whole of whatever you do already exists, you'd still say that the mindset of we should behave as if it doesn't exist is better.
Yeah, we should behave as if our actions can improve the future state of affairs, because they can. Because that's the thing is, what it means to improve them is to improve them relative to what we know and what we have experienced, I would usually think of like, yes, it's like that final state is already predetermined, but it's predetermined that we continually strive and continually make things better. And that doesn't seem fatalistic at that point, when you're thinking of it being predetermined. Oh, there's some kind of optimization going on in terms of the circumstances, and life gets better and better. It's like, okay, I would call that destiny rather than fate. It's destiny rather than fate.
Yeah, there's definitely this sense at least with the file analogy, where there's the complete timeline existing already, that whatever we do or whatever mindset we have, that's just going to be the case either way, because that's what's written into the file. So even if we did say, oh, well, there's no point in doing anything, then that's what our fate would have looked like regardless, after that point, because that's what's written into the file.
But I usually think of the difference I would draw between destiny and fate is destiny is about realizing your potential as fully as possible. And I think of fate as like a kind of truncation. Fate is associated in my mind with ways of thinking about action and your possible future that are self-limiting, basically. So I think of destiny as kind of an open-ended upward trajectory, whereas I would think of fatalism as a kind of closing down of, where you're like, well, if I'm fatalistic, then that's just what I was always going to be, and there's no way out of it. But it's like the only reason there's no way out of it is because that's what you've decided. And had you not decided that, then life could have got a lot better. And once you do decide to think in a fatalistic way, life tends to get worse. And so it's really just a question of whether you care about life improving, or, whether you're content to let it sort of degenerate and feel sort of self-satisfied that you're being like supremely logical, even though like the actual outcome of that is sort of more suffering for everyone.
Right. I guess it's kind of like the fatalists have the facts right, but the determinists have the mindset right in some sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does positing that model of the file open the doorways to other things in your mind, like time travel, or I don't know, sending messages back to yourself?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know. I tend to think that time travel isn't possible. That's generally my feeling about it, that there's some kind of like it causes logical problems generally. That's sort of I don't know. how you'd get around them and make it sort of work in spite of them. As to the idea of like sending messages backwards or forwards to yourself in time, that seems to me much more plausible. I don't really know either way, but some people talk about synchronicity as exactly that, as like your higher self or your future, like the future evolution of your spirit or your soul, sort of, I guess, guiding you on your path to become them, which, I think that's a workable way of looking at it. And there's nothing in my model that definitively tells against that, that's for sure. But I'm not sure where I stand on in terms of if it's actually correct or not.
How partial are you to the idea that there are infinite timelines that correspond to every possible behavior that you could do?
Um, I tend to think of parallel universes as differing in their fundamental constitution somehow. So I generally think that when we think of alternative possibilities in terms of things we could have done or something like that, like I generally think of that as a kind of counterfactual reasoning. That, like, for instance, when we're sort of evaluating a decision we haven't yet made, there seem to be many options open to us, right? And then we sort of narrow it down. And I think of the narrowing down process as a way of figuring out what it was that we were always going to choose, I suppose. Like, there's a set of values and principles that we as a person bring to bear onto the decision. There's sort of a set of environmental factors that form the information that we're taking in. And, those things being constant, like, if we could cut to the chase, there wouldn't be options. There's just, there's just the thing that makes the most sense, and you do that. And the reason we see options is because we're still in the process of calculating, basically, And as the calculation progresses, we narrow down the options progressively until we arrive at the thing that makes the most sense, and we always do that.
Cool. Okay. I'd love to take a step backwards quickly and try and find a through line between this model of, say, time and space and kind of things existing in this analogy of the file. How is that sort of suggested or guaranteed from these foundations like the PSR and the LI and things like that? What's the through line that you've made to come to that particular decision about how things are structured?
That being the file analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that comes with the idea of the possibility space entailing like all logical possibilities existing. In that context, my thought is that they all exist as complete objects because time is something internal to, like, the process of change and variation and all of that, becoming, is something internal to a possible world. It's not something that goes on, at least to my way of thinking, sort of in the metaphysical context or in that logical possibility space. My usual thought is that the logical possibility space just, in some sense, by definition, contains these possible worlds as complete possibilities, namely, from start to finish, everything that could ever happen or will ever happen is sort of contained in and entailed by the sort of formula that describes the fundamental constituents or the fundamental principles, the rules, the laws of nature of that particular world. Yeah, so if the derivation of specificity was done in a different way, then potentially that part of the model could be open to. It might be that time and space are not, that the B theory is not the correct way of thinking about time, and that, all the possible transformations that happen in space-time might not be in that sense, I guess, contained as a completed object. But yeah, I guess in terms of the question of like how do you get to that conclusion? It's basically the thought that, to extend the analogy, that the logical possibility space is like a cosmic hard drive that contains, all the possible movies, and then just in the nature of what it is, for, to be that video file, like from start to finish, like when you press play, it obviously sort of starts to change, but all that change is prefigured already in the code, and it itself doesn't undergo change just because you take on the perspective of traveling through what happens.
Right. So in some sense, all the possibilities exist sort of somewhat statically, and then in the logical domain, there are those existents playing out in some form. But
yeah, and specifically, and this is why I continually tie it to perspective. It's the way that it plays out is as, I guess, what it would be like to be a subject existing in that world. So if the possibility entails, the possibility of subjects within, as extant entities within that universe, then from the perspective of those creatures contained within that possible world then seems to them real and actual, as it does to us. And they take on the perspective of that limited perspective of not seeing the whole thing, and therefore, traveling through and I guess, having access into the present moment, which, in the analogy is like the current frame of the movie that's being played, And so the perspective sort of, of that creature sort of starts at a certain point and ends at a certain point, and the whole universe is significantly vaster than that. But yeah, from the limited frame that the subject has, that's the frame in which things appear to change and things appear to move, and everything is sort of dynamic in that sense and changing.
interesting. You can't picture this stuff because picturing it kind of implies a spatial dimension inherently. So it's not something you can just put your vision towards. But how is there a way that you prefer to visualize what's going on?
So I actually have a condition called aphantasia. I don't know if I've told you this before, but so
No, you
I
haven't.
have difficulty visualizing in general. I can visualize only the most rudimentary of things and not in very much detail, which predisposes me to be much more verbal in how I understand the world.
Mm.
And so in terms of like what I would think of as picturing, that's what the analogy is for me. The analogy of the file on the computer drive, that is my picture of it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right then. Well, let's stick with that.
Yeah.
That works. Yeah. This I find it a little bit curious about how you might model thinking and the brain and mind. Like, if is there a analogous way that you think about those things that matches up with how you think about like data logic with the being a hard drive and all that kind of stuff? Like, see thinking as on the brain as like a hard drive, and things are kind of stored in there and in the same way.
I suppose to put it very simplistically, in a very similar way. But I think consciousness is extremely mysterious, and I generally refrain from projecting a definitive picture of what that would look like. I think that consciousness isn't just confined to the brain. The brain seems to be a locus for consciousness, but it also seems to be distributed throughout the whole body. How memory works and what's going on when we remember, I don't know. It's a very complicated sort of thing. But I do think that the brain as a computer analogy has taken us very far so far in neuroscience and cognitive science, in terms of helping us to construct models of how the brain works that actually map onto the sort of observable facts. How far that metaphor can take us, I don't know. But, and also I'm conscious of the fact that, computers are like, in some sense, the most recent big innovation that we've had technologically, and of course but there might be something in the future, even more amazing than computers, and then we might use that as the metaphor. And I just don't know to what degree, I guess, I would want to limit my understanding of the brain to an analogy to computers. But on the face of it, it seems like a promising strategy.
Cool. I know that there are various models that try to model thinking and consciousness via the metaphysics. Is that something you're just trying not to do, or is it more like you're open to it, but you haven't found the thing that makes sense to you yet?
I would think I don't, it's something I guess I'm trying not to do because, I mean, I'm open to the idea that consciousness is sort of distributed, it's coextensive with matter in a kind of a panpsychist sense, that any sort of a thing that can take in information is to some very minimal degree conscious. But most of the time when I think about consciousness, I tend to localize that discussion around creatures like us. And creatures like us seem to be machinery. There's an analogy to machinery there. Like there's this biological complex system that is sort of self-regulating, and it develops higher capacities, and those end up turning into, I guess, the kind of consciousness that we really identify with, which is self-consciousness, self-referential consciousness. And so, and that's the thing as well, is I think that like the more complex the structure that your modeling gets, and consciousness, I think, is the most complex structure that we have ever encountered. The less it makes sense to lean heavily on the metaphysical foundation in terms of providing an explanation. Now, you want it obviously to be consistent, and so I would think of it like this sort of interaction of data and logic permits these sort of higher shades of complexity and subtlety. And all of that is sort of consistent with the formulation of it as data and logic, but, there's a certain level of complexity where it is similarly with the special sciences, like it seems to me that chemistry is sort of an extension of physics and sort of derivative of the physical mechanics of matter and motion. But it also seems to me that at a certain point, you can't talk informatively about what's going on in a chemical reaction just by talking about physics. There's a sort of a new domain. You have to sort of construct new principles to summarize what's going on. And I think that the higher up that sort of scale you go, from physics to chemistry to biology to sort of physiology and neurology and psychology and so on, the further up that scale you climb, the more and more it makes sense to talk about it in terms of things that are equally complicated. Well, that's why I think computers works very well, because it's also a system built up out of many smaller, more fundamental subsystems. Like just the computer that we're interacting with now, has like 5 or 6 layers beneath what we actually interact with on the operating system and the GUI and the random pieces of software that we might be running, all the way down to the assembly code, and then further than that into the actual electrical engineering of the component circuitry, and then further down into actually the nature of electricity, and sort of the more complex the thing that you're describing is, I think the less it makes sense to sort of say, well, it's all physics or it's all metaphysics, so let's talk about it in those terms. It's like, well, yeah, it is it does ultimately ground out in sort of fundamental principles like that. But if you want to sort of get a tractable and intelligible explanation, you're generally better off sticking with analogies to similarly complex systems and kind of looking for points of similarity and points of contact with that, and just kind of ensuring that those analogies conform to the truths of the fundamental principles.
Yeah, interesting. I'm quite partial to theories which explore various kind of scale-invariant systems that seem to suggest that there are relationships and dynamics that kind of go all the way through. I think electromagnetism is a good example of that. Something that, you get electromagnetism in quantum mechanical systems, you get electromagnetism in suns, and you get humans and planets and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like that's pointing to some kind of foundational dynamical relationship, and that maybe that would go deeper as well. Like that there's something about the structures in logic, for example, that make up our particular universe that are to do with electromagnetism dynamics. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Think about that. I mean, I'm similarly partial to the idea of scale invariant principles. And I actually think data and logic is a really good example of something scale invariant, something that no matter what scale you take, you still see the recurrence of these units of thought or of analysis. As to the question about electromagnetism specifically, I guess what I would generally do is I would ask questions surrounding generality. How general is this compared to proposals for the sort of metaphysical substrate? And I would generally think of electromagnetism as already being a complexification of data and logic. And one thing that it brings to mind is the yin yang. I think electromagnetism is a really good example of a polar system. And obviously that's the notion of polarity is quite fundamental, but is it the most fundamental thing? I think that's more questionable. And I think that really is where the analysis sort of comes to a head for me, is when we're asking, what is the most fundamental thing? Polarity is a good proposal. I don't think, though, that when you follow it to the end of the line, that polarity works. Partly because the polarity has to come from somewhere, has to be itself caused by something or grounded in something. Polarity is not standalone, or at least I've never heard a proposal of polarity that's rendered as standalone. And I think the best attempt to do that is the Eastern concept of interdependent origination, that the opposites call one another forth and make each other exist, which is an intriguing proposition. But I don't think it does, I don't think it does the explanatory work adequately. And part of the way I generally measure for that is I ask questions like the derivation of specificity. Okay, if polarity is fundamental, how do we get here? Why does this world exist? And it doesn't seem like there's a good or easy or obvious explanation in that respect.
Yep. I guess there are a few other elements of electromagnetism that you could do the same exercise with, like orthogonality and waves in general. And like waves are an interesting one because waves seem to be, they're scale invariant and they seem to be everywhere in existence.
Yes.
And
yeah,
brain waves to
definitely
quantum fields.
And in terms of that's another an area where I think conceivably that sort of step 2, step 3 combination, the exact nature of that sort of transcendental ground, might instead have something to do with points and waves, and then I would just be looking for, I guess, that derivation of specificity to be intellectually satisfying, in terms of considering that a plausible contender in that.
Hmm. But in some sense, it'd still be kind of in the domain of logic, right? Like it would still be that there would be a foundation of these rudimentary principles or foundational principles, I should say, and at some point, the form that takes are, for example, points and circles or waves.
Yeah, I would think so. It would just depend on what, I guess, how it was formulated to see whether it would get outside that or get beyond that. Like my initial prima facie impression is that yes, that would still sort of be in the sway of like what I would think of as data logic, or in the realm of sort of logical formalism or something like that. But it would really depend on the specifics of the theory, and that's not something I've really seen and fleshed out in a way that I find intellectually satisfying.
Cool. Well, that's the end of my notes and questions. But is there anything you think we've missed that is important to the system?
I think we've done a really good job of covering the fundamentals. I'm curious because I feel like we've gotten into some more details than we actually have discussed prior to this about the system, and I'm curious to hear your impression of it. Like, is it has giving it a more definitive shape in terms of those details? Has that sort of stoked your skepticism or made it seem more tractable? Or I'm curious to know how it's landed with you.
I think previously I might have modeled like time and space differently, but I kind of like the frame that you give of that it's like the potential exists in data. It's like all of that stuff exists already there in this. I call it static because it's sort of I don't know, like the forms in some sense. It's like where the relationships draw from, and I can kind of see it analogously to Whitehead's process ontology, where you've got the absolute objects. It's kind of, and God is kind of like data, and the actual occasions and their processes are logic. But I actually prefer the simplicity and the rhetoric that you provide in DM theory over Whitehead's. It's relatively new to me as well, so its rhetoric's I'm still getting used to it.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I'm not that far into the book, but it's impenetrable seems unfair, but it's definitely difficult for me to grapple with the kind of language I typically prefer.
Yeah, fair. And it's not Hegel, so it's at least there's something. I like the exploration with you and hearing these new ways of putting it, because I'm definitely open to exploring what these different ways of framing. I guess we'd call it derivation of specificity. Specifically, that realm, I think, is I'm trying to keep things open. I'm trying not to land on anything. So I'm just sort of putting these options that you're providing in the kind of like, that's interesting pile, along with a bunch of other possibilities. And yeah, so that's where it's landing for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, my way of maintaining the openness is actually a little different in that for me, it's like I have settled on something, but then I'm like, this is really just provisional. I can't, it's like I have a way of, I guess, explaining it to myself. If pressed, that's how I would explain it. But then I'm like, yeah, but I can't really know that this is correct. And also it seems open to objections. And so I'm like, that I guess I see that part of it as like something like, gravity exists, but as to the exact details of what gravity in the end consists in, those details might change. And I see it in a similar way. Like we have quite a sophisticated understanding, but I kind of put it in a provisional box where it's like, this is open to revision,
Yeah, no, I'd say the same thing. Like I'm coming from a place of specifics, and I think even just having your theory presented to me has been that process of being like, oh, here's another way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Maybe some things that I was thinking were wrong. And again, if pressed, because the theory that I've been involved in for 12 or so years is so embedded in me, then I'd use that rhetoric. But yeah, I'm trying to attempt to make something more my own. So it's
Yeah. No, I think that
trying
makes,
not to always fall back on that same rhetoric.
yeah, no, that makes sense. Hopefully what we went over today was informative for the listener. I felt like I was a little bit clumsy at the beginning of the discussion, kind of covering some of the backstory. It was a bit all over the place, I think, but we got better as we went on.
Yeah, no, I liked it, and I think that we'll probably do a more comprehensive backstory for us in another video. So it might be good that you didn't get into too
Yeah,
much detail there.
yeah, that's definitely true. Yeah,
Cool. Should we end it there?
yeah, that sounds good, man. Thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed it, and I
Yeah, it was
look forward
fun.
to next time.